Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Institute. My name is Curtis Austin. I am the Associate Director here. And again, we're glad that you've come out. And for our online viewers, thank you for signing on. On behalf of our director, Dr. Ron Brolio, we say thank you and welcome to the Humanities Institute. So it's my distinct honor to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Brett Rushforth, a distinguished scholar whose work has profoundly deepened our understanding of the early modern Atlantic world, particularly at the intersections of the African diaspora, indigenous Americas, and French colonialism. Dr. Rushforth currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Huntington Library Quarterly, a peer-reviewed journal renowned for its exploration of early modern art, literature, history, science, medicine, and material culture. In this role, he continues to shape scholarly discourse by bringing fresh perspectives to these diverse fields. His academic journey includes notable tenures at the College of William and Mary and the University of Oregon, where he has mentored countless students and contributed significantly to the study of early American history. Dr. Rushforth's scholarship is perhaps best exemplified by his acclaimed book, Bonds of Alliance, Indigenous and Atlantic Slaveries in New France. This seminal work delves into the complex relationship between French colonists and Native American societies, revealing how indigenous and Atlantic slavery systems intertwine to shape the social and economic fabric of New France. This book has garnered multiple prestigious awards, including the Merle Curti Award in Social History from the Organization of American Historians and the Mary Alice and Philip Boucher Prize from the French Colonial Historical Society. In collaboration with Christopher Hodson, Dr. Rushforth is set to release a new book titled Beyond the Ocean, A New History of France and the Atlantic World from the Crusades to the Age of Revolutions, forthcoming from Oxford University Press in 2025, this year, so be on the lookout for that. This anticipated work promises to offer fresh insights into the intricate connections between Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans over several centuries, further cementing his reputation as a leading historian in the field. Dr. Rushforth's dedication to unearthing and elucidating the nuanced narratives of colonialism, slavery, and cultural exchange has not only enriched academic scholarship, but also broadened public understanding of these critical aspects of our shared history. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Brett Rushforth.
Well, thank you, Curtis. I assume my microphone's on and we're okay. It's been just a pleasure to be here so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the trip. It's a bit of a reunion. Curtis and I used to stare at each other across the street during the COVID lockdown. We were neighbors in Oregon and colleagues and have been friends for many years, and it was a true pleasure to catch up last night. And it's also a real honor to me to be here at Arizona State for the particular reason that you'll notice in my subtitle, which I'm sure you recognize has resonance for the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I chose this subtitle, which I've never used before and don't plan to use again, but I chose it as an homage to the really wonderful, generative, challenging work that's been done at the center. And in specific, some of the work that has challenged me to undertake what I'm going to try to talk about today. So as I was finishing my portion of this book, I was writing chapters on the expansion of French merchants, priests, colonizers into the Atlantic in the 16th century. And I read some key works by, for one, my long-term fellow, Ian Smith. We were long-term fellows at the Huntington during this time. And his work really inspired me to think differently about pre-modern race studies and to try to think with different sources and different methodologies and different commitments to the kinds of resonance the work would have, not just with a scholarly audience, but with broader publics and with the descendant communities of the people that I was writing about in the 16th century. Other works, of course, teaching race before race in the European Renaissance has been a really important book that just came out, I think, a year and a half ago or so. And then Seeing Race Before Race, the introduction and a couple of the essays in that book really shaped the way I want to ask questions differently in the future. And so this is just a genuine thank you, and it's an honor to be at the site of such generative work. One of the co-editors of Seeing Race Before Race, Noemi Andai, who writes about race in 17th century France, gave a challenge in the introduction to her book to anyone who wanted to try to push that narrative back, to do both the archival work to understand what it was like in France, if there were a lot of people who were not of European descent. Were there people from West Africa? Were there indigenous people in France? That work was done for England long ago. And then scholars have built on that work in literature, performance studies, art history. That work has not really been done for France. So the first part of the project that I'm going to present is just a quick overview of what we've found in our research about what the sort of demographic and cultural exchange is like in 16th century France. And the second is then to think culturally and critically about ways that this society differentiated between those who would have power and those who would not, those who would be allowed to be full members of that society, those who would not, and also how those do or do not resonate with later periods and what changes and what stays the same. This is also partly influenced by my old friend Guillaume Aubert, who wrote this great article about that linked the discourses about nobility and noble blood in France and how they then transformed that discourse into talking about purity of blood for non-French people. So these are the influences and the inspiration. As Curtis mentioned, this work comes out of this ongoing project that Chris Hodson and I have been doing for now 17 years. We've visited over 100 archives and archaeological sites, churches, libraries, etc., to try to unearth as much as we could about the lesser known parts, particularly the non-French, non-elite perspectives on this colonial encounter across half a globe. And what I'm going to present today is parts of chapters 2 and 4 of that book manuscript. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this as though we are overhead looking at a river, actually at two rivers that join. One stream of that river is going to be historians who have talked in many ways about the demographics and the trade and the cultural exchanges in European expansion in the 16th century, but often without also looking at cultural, literary, artistic, material culture manifestations. The first stream will be the historical overview. The second stream will be my attempt to kind of look at the cultural side of this, to try to think about, in a critical way, the structures of difference-making, race-making, and power in a colonial setting. So stream one. Stream one begins with a story of a man known only in the records as Pois Blanc. Despite his name meaning white pitch, he was an enslaved West African man from the Senegambia region. He was captured by French merchants who were in the Americas trading in the Caribbean, and they took him either from a Spanish settlement in Havana or possibly modern-day Colombia, or potentially off a Spanish ship. But somewhere in the Caribbean, he was taken by Protestant corsairs and brought back to Dieppe in northern France. And during the time when he returned, France was in the middle of a civil war over religion. Specialists in French history know this all too well, but for the rest of you, a quick recap. Protestants and Catholics started a war of words that grew into a war of property destruction, and when people brought firearms to that war of property destruction, it grew into a shooting war. And over 4 decades, 3 million people died. It was a massive and devastating and long-lasting fissure in French society. And Poix Blanc came into this society after having been displaced and pulled around the globe multiple times. And the Protestant who claimed that Poix Blanc was his property was attacked by a Catholic garrison. 1,200 soldiers came and besieged the Protestant community of Dieppe in 1567. And as often happens, the enslaved man was pushed to the front of the defense crowd, handed a two-sided broadsword called an espadon, and he fought for his life. They thought he was fighting for their lives. Maybe he was, probably not. He was certainly fighting for his own. He survived. Eventually they came in and created a peace. But the governor, the Catholic governor of Dieppe, needed someone to die. And guess who it was? Poix Blanc was put forward as a sacrifice to satisfy the bloodlust of the Catholics and to keep from having further deaths in the Protestant community. As he ascended the gallows, the story goes among the Protestants, he started to sing the 51st Psalm. And eventually the Protestants chimed in. And according to the Protestants, eventually some of the Catholics chimed in. It didn't stop them from taking his life. But he became, in the Protestant lore, a martyr to their religion. They turned him into a hero for Protestant religion. And they said that he was a true believer. He led fearlessly, always at the head of the defenders, whom he encouraged by word and example. This sanctified him, despite his enslavement, despite his difference, and made him into a martyr, and he shows up in books of martyrs. So Poix Blanc was one of thousands of enslaved and some free people from West Africa and the Americas who ended up in France in the 16th century. It took an awful lot of work to create this little map on the right. It doesn't seem like much, but it came one document at a time, like you see on the left. It turns out there was a fairly substantial population of indigenous Americans and enslaved and some free sub-Saharan West Africans in 16th century France. There are documents from Catholic records, there are court cases, there are reminiscences, there are letters. In some cases, you have famous writers and poets incorporating these people, conversations with these people into their stories. And this all grew out of a much larger French engagement in Atlantic trade than we've previously thought. Just a very quick overview. If you want the full thing, you're going to have to read about 100 pages of this book. But just quickly, that doesn't show up great. But what this is a map of the Atlantic drawn by a pilot in 1583. And it reveals the depth of their knowledge of the Atlantic and their engagement in the Atlantic. In West Africa, there were 3 regions where they traded. One, they call the Malagueta Coast, modern-day Liberia, essentially. Another was the Gulf of Guinea, all the way from Côte d'Ivoire to Benin. And then also in the northern part of the north-south running area in Cape Verde, all the way down to Sierra Leone. They traded, in that region, Malagueta pepper, or sometimes known as grains of paradise. We've found evidence of this in recipe books, in language lists. French sailors memorized phrases and terms in the Kru language, which is a language in modern Liberia. And what linguists have learned is that they were all in the honorific. So they would say, "Sir, do you have any Malagueta?" And they would respond not in the honorific and say, "I do" or "I don't." They learned some phrases like, "You've put too many leaves in the basket. There aren't enough peppers." But they also learned about family. They learned words and phrases about friendship. And they developed a long-standing partnership with groups along that coast that lasted 90 years. And that displaced Portuguese competitors, that foiled English attempts to break in, and that lasted a very long time. Ivory was another item, and you can see the material culture resonances of this in France. Everything from the African-produced art, like the Oliphant on the right and the salt cellar in the middle, I guess the Oliphant in the upper left as well, and French-produced from African ivory items like rosary beads that proliferated in northern France at this time. They also traded gold. Now, Elmina, which is the famous, infamous castle in Ghana, is called Elmina the Mine, not because it was a mine initially for enslaved people, but because gold was the primary item of trade. French sailors traded there as early as 1481, and they traded in great numbers, starting in the early 1500s. And in one year, for example, 1558, they took 75% of the gold from modern Ghana. And the Portuguese were beside themselves, and they just could complain because they said, well, what they want from us is French cloth, but the French come here and they can undersell us. So complaint after complaint we found in Portuguese archives, in British archives, in Spanish archives. The French archives in northern France were largely destroyed during World War II. So that meant we had to be pretty creative in how we found these records. In the Americas as well, the French traded at in far greater numbers in Brazil and other areas like the Caribbean than we have previously appreciated. At some periods in the mid-16th century, there were 70 or 80 ships a year going to Brazil from France. They would fill the holes of those ships with dyewoods, which would dye cloth and other fabrics and textiles. And they also would buy parrots and monkeys. They would buy medicinals, things that they would call drugs, but it was anything from tobacco to canna-fistula leaves. And they were all in the effort to make a profit. On the left, you'll see a phrase primer for Tupi Guarani, which the French also learned with quite a bit of proficiency. This little terrible sketch, which doesn't show up great because of the brightness of the room, but this is just a sketch drawn by a pilot, not an artist clearly, but he is describing both the means of the dyewood being brought from the interior by Tupinamba men that they were allied with, and the road. He mapped the road where they came. This man spoke Tupi Guarani. He had spent months and months in Brazil every year, and eventually he was tapped by the King of France and a pretender to the Kingdom of Portugal to try to retake Portugal for this pretender, and he was promised a role in the governance of Brazil if he was successful. He was not. But unfortunately, as with the other European states that expanded, the French traders also were involved in human trafficking in much larger numbers than we thought. On the left is a Spanish record of a group of enslaved Brazilian natives who were brought by a French trader back to Normandy and then resent down to Spain where they were trying to sell them. But it was 2 years after Spain made indigenous enslavement illegal, so there was a court case, and that generated a record. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about these trades. And in the middle is a Portuguese record telling the Portuguese settlers of Bahia and Pernambuco to stop buying enslaved West Africans from French traders. The French traders, in their contracts, don't say they're trading slaves. But on the West African coasts, Portuguese, English, Spanish observers all say they are. And if you go to Brazil, if you go to Santo Domingo, if you go to any major Spanish settlement, in the second half of the 16th century, they are being supplied with French ships. And some of those enslaved people make their way back to France. On the right is a case where there was supposed collusion between a Spanish governor of one of their territories, I believe in this case it was Puerto Rico, trying to take enslaved people from West Africa brought by French traders who obviously didn't have a license to trade in the Spanish Empire. So that's just a quick overview of how we go from trade to enslavement to slave trades. And now I want to talk about the enslaved people. Now remember there, as I said on that slide, 200,000 French people spent time in the Atlantic, either in West Africa or in the Americas during the 16th century. That's about 180,000 more than most people thought. It really is a substantially redefined field of study, which I hope will open up opportunities for other people to do deeper and more targeted studies. So back to the map. We have lots of different examples of types of people who were enslaved and experiences they had as enslaved people. On the left is a letter written by Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon, who was charged by the French king with running the French colony in Brazil, known as France Antarctique. The colony failed, like most colonies do, but he did not fail. He became fabulously wealthy. He even got a payoff from the Portuguese government for giving up on the colony. He also brought back 40 to 50 enslaved Tupis himself. That's to say nothing of the rest of the people in Brazil, just himself. He gave some, went to Paris to the court of the king. Some went to Fontainebleau, which is the sort of hunting retreat and palace that the royals had. He gave 2 to his brother in Provence, which is an old medieval trade town. His brother lived there, and they show up in the Catholic parish registers, and it seems that they're siblings. 2 Tupi or Tupinamba, or I mean Tupinican enslaved people there. One was 16, one was 18. And all we know is that the record claims they've learned to speak a little French, just enough that they know who God is and what Catholicism is, and they knew enough to be baptized and to have that ritual connection. They worked an unknown number of years after that and then disappeared from the record. Villegagnon also kept many for his own household, an unknown number, and they would have worked mostly as domestic slaves, but whenever he found them unuseful, he would sell them, he would give them away. In one case, he gave a gift to a royal official just to curry favor. Another example, in Marseille, a random record, October 1563, the undersigned was baptized, a female slave, daughter of Jacob, of Mino Georges, which is Elmina, in Leona or Guinea. You see how this Marseille priest doesn't really know the geography of West Africa very well, not a surprise, but he does his best. And he says that this father is Portuguese, and they named her Spinoza, which for a long time I thought maybe it was the last name, maybe it is, but this is all we know. And so often these records are just exactly this stingy. So when we try to think about how race played out in the individual lives of people, that's a much harder thing to answer. Except that in many ways it structured the willingness of French people to enslave them, the willingness to trade them around for favor or profit. We don't really know much more about their experiences than what you're seeing here. Another example is Pedro Mandinga. From 1569 to 1571, he lived in a small French settlement of Pont-Audemer, which is in northern France as well. This was a Protestant stronghold during the Wars of Religion. He got there 2 years after Poix-Blanc died. You can imagine the Protestants told him the story. I don't imagine he found it comforting. Probably when he heard that story, this is my imagination, but certainly at some point when he was in Pont-Audemer, he hatched a plan. They kept him because they wanted to go back to Panama, which is where he had been enslaved, and he could pilot them into a very difficult inlet near Nombre de Dios. And they promised him that if he did that successfully, they would free him and let him marry another enslaved woman who was in the group. He didn't believe that they were going to keep their promise. So he guided them back to Panama, but then misguided them intentionally so they would run aground. And when they did, he jumped out, found his way to a Spanish official, and testified of what was happening, preventing a French invasion of Nombre de Dios in Panama, and he was freed by the Spanish for his service. So this reminds us, of course, that when we have documents that tell about the motivations of enslaved people, when we have documents that can reveal the kinds of pressures they faced, the kind of stories they heard, the kind of danger they were in, and the risks they were willing to take, we actually get a fairly complex understanding, and it's a reminder that that's also true of the people in the other documents. We just don't know exactly what those stories are. Last one. Antoine Delaunay ended up in Saint-Malo in 1597. And this one is a baptismal record that provides an unusual amount of detail. Saint-Malo, if my pointer worked on the screen, it disappears behind the glass or something. Saint-Malo is northwest France. You see it's the sort of most northwestern circled place. And the record describes him as a young boy of foreign birth, native of Guinea, the land of the Moors, black in color, appearing to be between 9 and 12 years old. And this, I think, is significant. They named him Antoine Delaunay with a last name, which often that was not done. And this young boy got to narrate his story. Delaunay told us that he was brought to this country by the captain Etienne Arthur Sieur de la Mothe. And that's all we know. But we know that sometime in the late 16th century, he was captured. He was traded to a European merchant who was sailing between Saint-Malo in Brittany and the West African coast. And he was able, at this point, to narrate something about his own past. He was likely a cabin boy if he is enslaved to a ship captain. 10 was the age that French boys would be apprenticed out to be with a ship captain if they were going to become mariners. And that probably would have been an area where he had to have a lot of communication, and so he probably learned to speak French much quicker as a young person and in a much more sort of communicative kind of role. So that's where we are. We have thousands of records like this, all of which, but just a few, are every bit as stingy. So the historical story about this, we can tell many kinds of interpretive stories. We can tell a story about the participation of the French in the transatlantic slave trade. If you look at the transatlantic slave trade database, it shows 4 French ships trading enslaved people during the 16th century. It attributes a couple of other possibles. But in 1 year alone, 1 year from one port, Le Havre, which is also in northern France, 1,000 French sailors left to go not just to West Africa, but to West Africa, then the Americas, and then back. And a high proportion of those ships had to be carrying, based on all we know, both in time and place. So there is a much higher participation. There's also a higher number of indigenous Americans enslaved in France in the 16th century. I wrote a whole book on indigenous slavery in France and in the French colonies, and didn't know anything about this. And this is something that I'm learning, and I can tell you some parts of my last book that are wrong because of what I've found here. So those are stories we can tell. But where does it fit with the broader story of European race-making, of the racialization of slavery specifically, and of the racialization of colonialism? And that's the second piece of this story. The second stream, the one that is more cultural, the one that is looking more at the European perspective of how they're viewing these people and these power structures. I'm going to take you to Le Puy, which is in south-central France. And the cathedral at Le Puy is a stop on pilgrimage routes ever since the Crusades. There is in that cathedral, there was in that cathedral, a Madonna, a black Madonna, with Jesus on her lap, that some said came to the church long before anyone had records. Some say it came in the 11th century from the First Crusade because Le Puy was a major jumping off point for crusaders. Others say it came in the 13th century, but we know that by the 13th century, there are records of pilgrimage from royal households, so they have survived. And we see that this Black Madonna was venerated by French people for centuries. In Le Puy, they were so used to getting pilgrims come through their town that the town's economy came to depend on these pilgrimages. And they started to produce coins and little paper tokens, like postcards essentially. They produced replicas for the wealthy. For instance, Francois I, the King of France, got a gold replica of the Madonna of Le Puy made for him. Others got really cheap hand-carved wood ones, and some just got a hand-drawn image on a piece of paper. This painting on the left is a painting of that statue. The original was destroyed during the French Revolution. So what we have is this 17th century painting, and then once it was destroyed in the 19th century, the one on the right was made to replace it. And they continue to venerate this one on the right to this day. So during the Wars of Religion, one of the major points of contention between Catholics and Protestants had to do with icons. The Bible says, "You shall have no graven images." And Protestants determined that that meant you're not allowed to have any statues that you venerate. You're not allowed to have images of religious figures that are part of your religious culture. And they went about France destroying these in churches. And one of the ones they targeted first was Le Puy, because it was not only an icon, it was not only an idol in their imagination, it was also an idol factory. Like, it was just generating a profusion of idols that were spreading all around France. If they could kill the idol factory, they would save a lot of souls. So they took an army and they besieged it. And they went in, and the Protestants started to say some pretty horrific things that give us a sense of some of the language of race that was available to people at the time to be deployed in moments like this. In order to shame the Catholics, they started to say mean things about the Black Virgin. They said, "You realize this is just a hunk of wood, right?" And then they said things that started to veer toward race, and then absolutely dug in to concepts of racial difference. They called it a dirty, blackened thing. In part, this reflects a debate about the origin of the statue. Is this statue black because it had been around for so long with candles and soot, or is it black because it was made of material like ebony, or that it was painted to be black? The priest who kept the church insisted that it was painted black and that it came from Egypt or somewhere in the Near East, and that the color was evidence of that. Others said, no, it's just dirty. Those little papers that they handed out, the little postcardy things, they called them asswipes. And then they said things that I won't repeat, I'll let you read. But more like a devil than the Son of God. This draws on deeper imagery that I'll talk about in just a second. One of the Protestants wrote a plea to the people of Le Puy, which was then passed around France. "Please turn yourselves away from such crass idolatry. Tear down your crude and frivolous black idol, which has neither sense nor intelligence." And the rest, you can see that they draw on the kind of simian, racist language that would become so common in the later period, but at this time was still quite rare. Certainly, it was not in print culture very much, but you see it captured here. Well, in response to this, the Catholics mounted a defense of the Virgin by embracing beautiful blackness. They wrote poems, they wrote plays, and the priest that took care of the church made a long argument about why her blackness is evidence of her holiness, not the opposite. A poem from a play in 1518, the image was prophetically made of the Virgin Mary, from which it scarcely deviates from the first chapter of the Canticles. the wisdom and authentic words of this very noble virgin suggests when it says, "I am black but beautiful, children of Jerusalem." It turns out the "but" there was introduced to that scriptural reference in a Latin translation, that the original Hebrew is black and beautiful. And so it's even more of an embrace of beautiful blackness. Odo de Gissi, who's the priest in charge of the church, who's a caretaker there, he says, "The faces are black, a complexion remarkably agreeable to the Egyptians and Saracens where she was painted and brought from." That was a relativistic approach to skin color, suggesting it was not, to him anyway, at least not in this context of argument, it was not that blackness was equated with sin or that blackness was equated with any of the negative things that the Protestants just said. Instead, in his words, blackness is evidence of her ancient origins and evidence of her holiness. He also told a story in this document where he talks about Protestants who were coming to criticize or maybe tear down the Virgin, and that their skin turned black and they fell on the ground. Now, he didn't describe this as a miracle because they were sinful and therefore black. He said they were turned black to remind them of their duty to venerate the Holy Virgin. So their blackness in this case was a miracle performed by God that was going to return their souls to the right path. Again, a bit of a turn on the sort of standard trope of blackness and devils that the Protestants were trying to pull on, and an innovation that suggests, I think, what is one of the most important things we can take away from this, is that there was no shortage of crude, what we would recognize today as racist language about people who were different from French people in French culture. If you wanted to, you could find it. There was also no shortage of different ways of talking about both blackness, indigeneity, and other populations that had been othered and set aside. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a power structure, which I'll talk about in a second, but it does mean that the content of that cultural the content of the discourse is less important than the context and its power, it's sort of the deployment of power through that language. Now, the language that was used by the Protestants draws on very deep and very pervasive tropes that were circulating throughout 15th and 16th century France. One of the most common books to circulate, manuscript books to circulate around France, was called the Marvels, or the Marvels of the World. They generally contained things like travel accounts, Marco Polo, Mandeville, and others, put together with fantastic speculations about the world, and then also some discussions about the known and immediate world. It was layered like that. This is an example of one that's from 15th century France. And if you see on the left, it's probably pretty hard to see. It's a diplomatic meeting between some French rulers and a North African Muslim ruler. And the North African has a retinue of enslaved black sub-Saharan Africans with him. And the language of the Marvels books is remarkably consistent. They're manuscripts, but they're repeating the same phrases over and over. And they read something like this: "The men of Europe are stronger, more beautiful than those from Africa." And they attribute this, what they see as hideousness, to being too close to the sun. So they also start to refer to Africa as the burnt or scorched land. And that is before any number of French people have been there. So in the absence of that, there are these circulations of what Geraldine Heng has, I think, rightly talked about as tropes that show a way of thinking about the world that is racial. Now, the broad sense of this comes from the biblical story of Noah, 3 sons, one of whom went to Asia, one of whom went to Europe, one of whom went to Africa, and they each ended up having different descendants, and their descendants have characteristics that reflected their geographies. Now, on one hand, that is a pretty deep well. How many generations back do you have to go to get to Noah? I can't do that math, but it's a lot. So it's a suggestion that however maybe temporary or situational these might be, they go back a long way, and they have a deep and probably fairly intractable history. But they correspond with another way of thinking about those three sons and how they represent the world. And that is the tradition of the adoration of the Magi, which in the late 15th century and throughout the 16th century, it was very common to depict these three kings from the Bible coming to venerate the newborn Jesus as being one king representing Asia, one king representing Africa by the name of Balthazar, an Ethiopian Christian in later lore, and then one king representing Europe. And the Balthazar character in many accounts, many works of art, whether they're paintings or these smaller books of hours that were personal devotional books that you'd have in your home, depict Balthazar as black. This, in many ways, is suggestive of a hope that they had that Christianity would be able to be universal. And in fact, they said, Ethiopians are some of the best people in the world because they have this deep history of Christianity, and their hope was that they could either discover sub-Saharan African Christians or make sub-Saharan African Christians. The idea was that through time, but probably not through choice, through colonialism and through power, they could ensure that these people would be Christian, and therefore over time they would be the same as Europeans. That's a long time horizon in most people's idea. So in many ways, although they seem really different, the narrative of Balthazar, a king bringing gold to venerate, or it depends on the account. Some show gold, some show frankincense, some show myrrh. But it seems like that's a mostly positive image, and that the marvels tradition is a mostly negative image. But in the end, what determines Ethiopians' worthiness within this scheme is how Europeans see them as being good or bad Christians, or Christians at all. So in the end, the ultimate goal. This was sewn up by a narrative that was used both in discussing books of hours and in discussing the marvels tradition, which was about the salvation of the Gauls in ancient France. They venerated Mark Antony, of all people. They thanked him for conquering their ancestors, because before they were conquered by Rome, they said in book after book, we were a ferocious and ungovernable people. We were cruel, we were vicious. All the words used to describe non-Christians in the 16th century, they described as having been their own history. Thank God, they say, literally, that the Romans conquered us, then the Romans were Christianized and we were Christianized, and now we are the wonderful people we are today, and now it is our turn to be heirs of the Roman Empire and to ensure that we do the same favor for the rest of the world. So even the most positive of these narratives, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africans, has as its endgame a universalist, yes, idea, but one that requires, in their own history and in their own mind, a conquest and prolonged subordination over centuries, not years, over centuries. Now, there were other images of both indigenous and black people in France. There are lots of other things people could draw from. If you're trying to sort of think about what the common person, they're not reading books of hours. They aren't wealthy enough to have one. They aren't literate. What they see instead is things that they pass in the street, things that they encounter in their church, people that come to the harbor. This here is an oak panel that was put on the outside of a building in Rouen in France. They were one of the largest traders of Brazil wood. And this depicts, if you can see it, I hope you can see it, a Brazilian man here handing off a cut log to a French boatman who then would take that small boat over to the large ship and load it up. If you look carefully at it, you see that there's a lot of classical imagery here, right? The shape of the body, the posture. But look who is looking down on whom. This man seems to be giving instructions to the French man. And whoever's above or below, what we can see is that they are bound together by their mutual hold on that Brazil wood. As the century progressed, that bind would get tighter and tighter. The French would become more and more invested in it, and the Brazilian natives who did not want to be under Portuguese control depended more and more on the French to help them stay out of Portuguese control. Because at this time, the Portuguese were slaving in Brazil in massive numbers. And so the French thought this was an opportunity. We can put ourselves out as the protectors of these people from the Portuguese, and we can look good in the bargain. And I've actually lost my time, so I'm just making sure I'm doing all right. I'm about to wrap up here. There were also other narratives of French people who engaged in trade with the coastal peoples of West Africa, and they had their assessments as well. For instance, Jean Alphonse, who was a pilot, he was actually a Portuguese pilot who was fleeing the Inquisition in France, and he engaged in trade all along the Guinea coast, and he said, these are good people, and they will do you no harm if they are not harmed first. He made this assessment in this manuscript, and then eventually after he died, it was published in a collection of his travels in France in the mid-16th century. There was also a lot of imagery of sovereignty. So, for instance, the Vallard Atlas, which is held by the Huntington, was drawn by a French mariner and an artist who helped. On the left, you see the image of Tenochtitlan. It's not the typical stepped pyramids you see. It's, in fact, a bunch of French-looking castles. They're translating that sovereignty into something their audience understands. It's a statement, at least, that at one time, the Aztecs were sovereign. And in fact, they loved that statement because it was an indictment of the Spanish. And so there were all kinds of statements about how indigenous Americans had been wronged by the Spanish, they were innocent, they were good, we need to protect them. There were also evidence of West African sovereignty. Pierre Crignon in 1529, who traded in both Liberia and Brazil, he said, the people obey their king like our people obey our kings and princes. And this narrative of sovereignty was widespread throughout the community of people who traded. Now, mostly this was also cynical, because when the Portuguese said, you can't trade here, they said, well, actually, the sovereigns are the ones who live here. You're not sovereign over this territory. So they actually made explicit arguments for the sovereignty, and I thought I had a quote there, but they made explicit arguments for the sovereignty of indigenous people in the Americas and of West Africans in order to protect themselves against Portuguese claims of exclusivity. In the mid-16th century, the first book that sort of really breaks out of the Marvels tradition was published by Leo Africanus, in French known as Léon l'Africain. And his entire book is about differentiating people, not lumping everyone from sub-Saharan Africa, but talking about all the ways they're different. He talks about their diverse progenies and lineages. They have different histories, they have different cultures. He says some lived a beastly kind of life and others were poets and philosophers. Those differences were then seen to be more reliable because they came from eyewitnesses. Here's a poem in this book, the description, both the story and narration. This is an English translation of this terrible French poem, so I tried to make it as terrible as possible. Both by story and narration of those who saw it, men of great thought and greater deeds, who boldly fought storms and seas to discover the lands of strangers, manners, people, men who savage be, to whom still more savage are we. And that narrative of French savagery is picked up as the century progresses, and as violence in the civil wars continue, they start to indict themselves. Whatever we might see as the tragedies, as the tragic characteristics of these societies outside of France, however bad they are, we're worse. And another one, André Tevet, just another example of sort of questioning some of these older narratives. This is a poem at the beginning of his cosmography in 1575. Having returned, you who disdains the ancients' error, to us explains, a place thought burned beyond repair, despite their words, is fit to live. The falling rain does succor give, refreshing land and air. So time and time again, as the 16th century progresses, understandings of West African culture in France proliferate. Understandings of indigenous American culture are being established for the first time, but the central thing you can take away is just how different they were, how often they competed with each other. That said, the negative stereotypes remain incredibly persistent. They don't get replaced, they just get supplemented. Supplemented with stories that people need for various other reasons. And we're out of time to really slow down and talk too much about this, but just to suggest that this, published in the later 16th century, reflects much of the language in the Marvels tradition, much of the language that was being discredited right these very years by other thinkers and other people who traveled and engaged. Savages were all around the world. They were in Scotland. They were in the Americas. But in areas where the French liked to trade and have alliances, they depicted them much more positively. So Brazilian women who were indigenous, it just talks about them selling parrots and monkeys. And the Brazilian men just bring dyewood. The others are characterized in very different ways. Remember our bad artist from before who was drawing the dyewood? This is his depiction on a frame of the women to represent the 4 regions of the world, now that there are 4 and not 3. You notice that in the upper left is Europe, fully clothed with all the accoutrement of power. Lower left, Brazil. She's holding a face and roasting someone over the fire. This is someone who speaks Tupi-Guarani, someone who's lived for long stretches in Brazil. And he draws this and then starts to call the market square outside his house the Marché de Carnavals, a name that sticks until the French Revolution. The image in the center, another image that we could address for a lot longer than we have time for. Hopefully this will be the beginning of some real thinking about what these images suggest, what they don't suggest. But the main point is that there is an awful lot of unanalyzed material for these questions. I think we'll have to skip past those. Last thing I want to do is just talk about this one book of hours. This is in the late 16th century, right about the time that we have Antoine de Launay showing up in Saint-Malo. We have this book of hours. Even after the Balthazar tradition is starting to fade by the end of the 16th century, this family in northern France, in Amiens, has this in their possession. They, in fact, record on the left a baptism of their family, which allowed me to get into the archive and figure out who they were. And it turns out the father of that family is an ivory trader. And it just makes me wonder, what can we do with this image? With an image owned by people keeping these kinds of stories alive long after they are starting to fade, someone who is engaging in the ivory trade probably has an enslaved person who perhaps is this man. Where can we find the intersection between these stingy sources and these stories that center Europeans and their ideas about other people? How do we balance analysis of structural power and of the experience of people who we don't want to reduce to what Europeans thought about them? How do we tell stories that will take this ivory trader, this is how I found out he was an ivory trader, this is his tomb, and that will decenter him in favor of the people they tried to subordinate? And can we have a critical race studies that is designed and purposely aimed to be reparative and to speak to and be relevant to 21st century concerns, that also engages in the perspective that is not European, the perspective that doesn't come from the sources you can trace from the ancient world of the present, the structures that are outside power. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Anyone have a question or a comment for Professor Rushforth? Okay.
Maddie asks, are there indicators in other areas of European culture that point to an epicenter of these sentiments as uniquely Protestant? Or were there other factions that were speaking about blackness this way, and Protestants on crusades were the most documented at the time?
It's a really great question. It's actually one I've wrestled with. There's no denying, if you compare travel accounts from French versus English, West African voyages, the English accounts are much more virulently racist. I mean, there's just no, I've tried to argue with that. I've tried to not believe it. But it's just too pervasive. I don't know that it's Protestant, though. I mean, I think there's a much more complicated history there. But the other thing is that in this particular case that I talked about, the Catholic was arguing for beautiful blackness, and the Protestants were arguing the other way. If the power was different in that particular struggle, they would each argue the other side. They're arguing whatever works for them at the moment. So, for example, you have Protestants who are involved in the decision to illegalize slavery in France. They're trying to do that in various locations, but in 1571, something I couldn't talk about here, Sue Peabody and many others have written about this. There's definitely evidence that Protestants were involved in that. So the anti-slavery impulse, as well as Catholics involved in the pro-slavery impulse and the inverse. So I couldn't find across all these records any indication that Protestants or Catholics had a clearly different way of understanding the ideas. So yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's one I'm going to be wrestling with for a while. Yeah, we have a question here.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking about that kind of question too.
I think we need the microphone for the people online.
I understand. Thank you very much for this talk. I really learned a lot from it. I was thinking about that, pretty much that question too, and I was thinking about it comparatively. Like, what about if you take Spain in this period, where they're developing a casta system, and maybe you can argue it's more racialized, where there's more of a suppressed Protestantism perhaps in Spain because of a different kind of Inquisition, and like that could be an interesting model to like gauge the racialization versus how much of it is religious. But also thinking about counter-Reformation Italy and some of those later murals and things, you see people of color. They look very similar to these Magi images. But the big difference, I would think, is the presence of a Morisco community. Like when we're talking about Spain, maybe there's more multi-ethnic tension, perhaps, than in what's happening in France. That might also influence the way that these are being racialized. That was a question mark.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's no question. I think the part that isn't so much a question mark in the literature, at least, is that Spain has had hundreds of years of these sort of multi-confessional tensions. One group in power, another group in power, a lot of local shared power, a lot of intermarriage, but also a lot of efforts to police and bound.
I mean, exactly at this period, Limpias et Sangre is becoming the law.
Exactly, exactly. And so the question in France is a little bit different in the sense that as the Spanish are talking about this sort of purity of blood, the French are too, but they're talking about it mostly in terms of the French nobility. So they're using it to differentiate elite French people from non-elite French people much more than they are French people from other people. In the 17th century, that changes dramatically. And they actually deploy the exact same language They employ the same laws. And in fact, some of the earliest cases, Guillaume Aubert, whose article I put up there, he shows how these mésalliances, mixed marriages that were used to police the boundaries of nobility are then used to police the boundaries of whiteness with almost no effort at all. It's just not happening in the 16th century, partly because there's just not the same kind of colonial setting yet.
Yeah, I'll cede my time, but I was thinking about if you took the French history, took it into the 1680s, 1690s, when they're much more aggressive in the colonialism and in the Caribbean, and they're plundering slaves from Dutch colonies. So, like, what I mean, I would be curious to trace this into, further in the future and see how that's changing.
Yeah, and in fact, they're plundering enslaved people in the 16th century as well. In fact, Jean Bontemps, for example, he is a Dieppe trader. He could be the person who brought Poiblon into Dieppe. He was certainly one of the candidates. He did raids on Spanish ships. He did raids on Spanish settlements. And always the goal, more than anything else, was enslaved people because they could be sold quickly and lucratively. Whereas if you stole a bunch of hides or sugar, you then had to go back to France and convince somebody that it wasn't stolen. Instead of just like you're in Puerto Rico and you go over to Santo Domingo and you sell people. And so Jean Bontemps involved in that. He is killed in the project of raiding for slaves. His widow keeps things going by investing in more corsair activities. His grandson is Jacob Bontemps, who is given the first license on Saint Christophe and is given the first slave trade license in Senegal, in the Senegal River Valley. So like it's this family affair that goes on. They are Protestants, but I don't think they're slave traders because they're Protestants. I think they're slave traders because their opportunities are structured in a way by needing to get out of France, because after Bartholomew's Day, they won out. And so many of them start to take up residence in the Caribbean or whatever.
Yeah, the Huguenot diaspora is a whole other aspect.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Hi, this was so great. I just love the variety of materials that you're working with and how many pieces of that you were able to share with us. I just have a basic kind of methodological question generated by the Race Before Race initiative, which is when we're faced with all of this contradictory and situationally specific evidence, right, where you can find examples of people extolling black beautifulness and people denigrating black ugliness, and you have contradictory images and narratives and traditions. How do you begin to craft a narrative about the emergence of race as a concept, as a formative principle? And I imagine that it's disciplinary different. I think historians would probably have a different way of answering that question than literary scholars might or art historians might. I think historians were more empirical. Generally, we might think of like just add it up. How many, like, here's the column of positive images and here's the column of negative, and which is stronger. But that's obviously not going to be sufficient. As you said, you can find evidence on both sides all the time. So it's more of a conversation. So how do we do that?
What you can't find is a lot of conversations about French people being inferior or French people being the targets of these debates where people are dying. Yes, there's battles over religion, but like it's always in the context like our people are the best, and then as you go out, they're a little worse every time. This starts with Aristotle, right? You know, the Greeks are the best and everybody else is the worst. So I think there are two things that I think about that. So one is that there's the word race. I think people get tripped up on that a lot. There are ways we can think about that. I think about this in terms of slavery as well, right? So in my last book, I had a real debate with myself. Slavery can be lots of things. And when you say slavery, most people think of, in America at least, plantation-based racial slavery. So you could say that's what slavery is, a narrow, very specific, temporally, geographically, kind of, you limit it. So you're splitting the difference. I chose instead to have a more capacious understanding of slavery. It was more globally informed, I think. And that worked really well for me to be able to put things together. I think in similar ways, that's true of the word race, right? So there is this kind of idea that there's a moment where we can definitely know that race is there, and usually it's the scientific racism, it's whatever. And part of it is getting away from that, because even then you can say, well, it's not the same as 19th century racism. It's definitely not the same thing as eugenics, because it's maybe motivated by similar things, but the science is different. The basic understanding of inheritance is different. And you could do that for any time and period. So Geraldine Hayne makes this point that she says race is the impulse and the practice of differentiating through power, not the content of what is used to enact that power. So I understand that approach, right? Because I think it's, if we kind of, Ian Smith used to say this over time, like you could tie yourself in knots over nomenclature, right? Relax about the nomenclature and let's just talk about what's happening. And it's totally legitimate to talk about that as racism, as long as we understand that what we don't mean is 19th century racism. But we also can see, I mean, if we were to put a lot of these things in context today, we would just absolutely call it racism without any hesitation. So I think that this is the thing. So I don't have the capacity yet, or maybe ever, to sort of say, like, this is the date racism began, April of 1562, it started. And I think that the terminology can trip us up a bit. But what I do think is useful is to think about simultaneously those structures of power, those impulses to inequality, as one early French West Africa relations book talked about, the impulse to inequality, the sort of strategies of demonizing and othering. We can find continuities in all of that and find that useful. I think we can also find it useful to say, what is different about the content? I think it's quite different when you talk about race being inheritable, or status, or legal status being inheritable, than if it's not, right? The up and in versus the up and out, and if you're talking about a time horizon of centuries, yes, it's universalist, but in a way that we probably wouldn't recognize today either as like, hey, yeah, I can be equal in 300 years or 500 years. Sounds great. So I think that, I have tended in the past to get too caught up. So in my last book, what I did is a broad view of slavery and a narrow definition of race. And now I'm thinking much more in terms of like being a little less policey about the boundaries of when I use the word race, because I don't mean what I meant in the first book. So, that's not a satisfactory answer. And I'm hoping out there are people who, will be able to continue to help me think through this.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. So many questions. One coming from someone who doesn't know the period well, is you did a great job of looking at this sort of almost the biopolitics or the racial politics that have to do with basically power relations and how race was used in relationship to that. And I'm wondering about the relationship between that kind of racialized slavery and the white indentured servants and indentured kind of slavery that we're seeing both in Americas and in Europe at the time, and where those are positioned in power relations, as we're talking about kind of the regular people and how they're thinking or talking about things.
Yeah, so I would not call indentured servitude slavery. I think it's really important we make that distinction because it's temporary. Even if it's theoretically temporary, it's temporary, right? And if you survive your indenture, there are legal claims you can make to getting out of that arrangement. And the expectation of the system is that you will rise up out of that condition and then be a fully accepted part of that society. And in fact, it's the intent of that system is to bring people to places to do labor and then to have them stay and build that society. Definitely not the case for enslaved West Africans and Native Americans, who are meant to, if they ever rise up, to occupy a lesser position, and certainly not to be the foundation of that society. So I think that's a really important difference. Now, that said, there are ways in which these vulnerable populations end up spending a lot of time together. They end up being treated differently than other free people in that same society. One study has shown that like the mechanisms for control and capturing runaways and taking people to court that are designed for enslaved people also get utilized to recapture servants and things. So that is my partner, Allison Madar, has actually written about this. And so I think that there are ways in which they overlap and are connected and ways in which they're really quite different. And I think treatment, which is one way that some people say, well, they treat servants badly too. Well, yeah, for 7 years, not for generations. And that's a difference. I think that's pretty important.
That's what's interesting is it's the mode by which you can begin to see the fault lines.
Right.
In relationship.
Yeah, so there's a great book. Simon Newman wrote this book called The New World of Labor. And he looks very closely in the Caribbean at these moments of divergence. Ed Rugemer's done some work on this as well. Many others, Kristen Block, about how these things just sort of start to be very clearly articulated. And one case is like if an enslaved person and a servant run away together, they receive different punishments. You know, if there are children, you know, those children have different statuses. If they are up for punishments, there are certain punishments that just will not be administered to, you know, the white population. And so there are just all these ways that you can start to see. I mean, I think you see it from the beginning, really. But as you sort of clearly articulate what racialized slavery looks like, it essentially gets further and further away from those things. The same thing can be said of like the domestic servants, right? So many of these people that I showed evidence of, they're going to be in households, and they're going to be working alongside French domestic servants, right? Kitchen maids and the rest. The difference is those children grow to be adults and they go on to their own lives. You know, they have families. They probably have families in the area that may not have the means to care for them, but probably can, you know, help defend them in the sort of extreme situations. None of that's true of these people who are brought from afar and considered completely different. Also, if you're wandering around Normandy and you're a French boy of 12 versus a Tupiniquin boy of 12, you're going to have many more opportunities to sort of blend in, to get away if you're in that situation.
So one last thing is a bit off topic, but did you want to say anything about the Huntington Quarterly?
Sure. So I mean, the one thing I will say is that, you know, as Curtis mentioned at the beginning, it's our real goal to try to make this journal as engaged with these kind of conversations as we can. It's been a high quality journal for a very long time. It has not really been engaged in these conversations, and it's really important to me that we get engaged in those conversations. So many of the board members that have been appointed are interested in this kind of work, and we want that to be a signal to people of the kind of work we're interested in publishing. So that, I think, is all that needs to be said. And anyway, it's a privilege. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to anybody out there who might have stuck around this long.
All right. Thank you.